Hi, everyone, and enjoy my lack of a haircut in the pandemic. So I'm here today to talk about backgrounds, and let's see if I remember how to share my slides. Let's see. Yeah, my lack of a haircut is perfect, you mean. There it is. I knew I'd find it eventually. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Please do not laugh at my desktop. And there we go. So yeah, today I'd like to talk about design and the background and design in the background. And what this is really about is some of the things that we don't really think about in CSS, some of the stuff we take for granted or don't really consider at all. And I'm going to use my own site for a lot of the examples here, but I will have some other things. It's not just about me. It's really about what we can all do with CSS. So this is meyerweb.com. Last April, I gave it this design. And this actually has a lot of backgrounds and a lot of background design in various places. Some places that you might not necessarily realize are backgrounds until they're pointed out. So in some ways, the most complicated of all this, but also in some ways the easiest to understand, is the background of the body itself, right? So here's what it looks like basically, okay? And if you sort of look, I'm not sure how well this is coming through the streaming, but there's a textured pattern to the page. And if you want to, I mean, we're all on the web right now. You could always go to the actual site, meyerweb.com, and see what it looks like in a browser. But I'll make more obvious what this is. So here's what that body looks like without a body background, right? Here's what the page looks like if I just take away all of the body background. But the way this gets put together is the first step is the last layer. And this is the thing that trips people up sometimes. It trips me up sometimes, which is that when you have multiple backgrounds on an element, they go from highest to lowest. So from the top to the bottom, sort of like the layers in the Photoshop layers palette or Figma or whatever application you're using that has layers. Usually the one that's closest to you visually is the one that's on top of the list. And that's how it works with background. So first step, last background layer, solid color. If you're going to have a solid color, it can only be the final layer of a background. You can't put it elsewhere. But then just above that, there's a tiled background image, this one. Now this shows the tiling, and this is how it gets brought in. The exact placement doesn't necessarily matter that much. It's just I brought in this image and then tiled it. But then I have that same image also tiled, but it has a different origin, right? This is sort of the important point, is that there are two copies of this tiling in exactly the same way, but they start in different places. So when the two are combined together, it looks like this. Right, you get this repeating pattern. That glow behind the nav links is a radial background on that element. I won't have time to explore it today, but that's why there's that white sort of glow behind the navigation links. So anyway, we have this repeating pattern. And then down at the bottom, this pattern runs straight into where the footer is. And I felt like I needed a visual transition leading into that footer, right? I didn't want it to get cut off exactly because of what I was going to do with the actual footer. Because this is what the actual footer looks like, but that there's an upward pointing gradient that starts above the footer and fades out over close to 20 if I remember correctly. Oh yeah. So that size is based on the footer size and also some experimentation, but the point is that it creates this very gradual transition from the repeating pattern to a lack of repeating pattern, so that when this whole design comes together, the footer stands out a little bit more. It doesn't sort of get subsumed in the the visual pattern of the whole background. And then there's a similar approach, excuse me, up at the top for the masthead. But I want to point out that it's not pointing exactly downwards, right? If I'd said to bottom, that would have been the same as saying 180 degrees. But I didn't say either of those. This is actually at 179 degrees, because this is what it looks like at 180 degrees. Notice where it lands on the MeyerWeb.com text and how it sort of sticks to the bottom of the wave. Like, I could do that. It's very sort of ordered and regular. That's not what I was going for here. I was going for something a little more organic. So literally, I offset it by a degree. I changed it by a degree. And some of the background sort of overlaps with the text, the MeyerWeb.com, and it sticks down a little bit more into the bottom of the wave. It just feels more organic to me, and I really like that. And remember, this is a gradient still on the body background. This is all backgrounds that I'm adding to the body. And then above those is a gradient, which is too complicated to show here, but I basically masked over all of that. I'm gonna show what that looks like by really upping the colors. So this is what that looks like. I made it more obvious by just lowering the lightness of all of the HSL colors. So it has sort of these shadows on the sides that fade into a mostly opaque, color in the center. Mostly opaque, not completely, but mostly. So if I take all of that away, here it is as normal. And if you look really closely, the tiled images in the background are faintly visible in the side white space, but they disappear under the text column. I actually made it this gradient, this sideways gradient, fully opaque in the middle and a little bit transparent, mostly opaque, almost completely opaque, sort of along the sides. And then they fade into this sort of shadow pattern, shadow along the sides, to give it more of a actual textured feel, what it would look like if it were an actual page, an actual parchment page. And then along the top, here's that top gradient. I've just made it a little darker to be able to see. This actually was how I had the page styled early on. I was originally thinking of giving it much more of a sort of an old parchment feel, and I ended up feeling like that was a little too distracting, and it was a little more difficult to create the right kinds of contrast that I wanted for both accessibility reasons and visual design reasons. So I ended up lightening it a lot, and it ended up like this. So, it's more paper than computery. So that was a lot of backgrounds to sort of layer on top of each other for the body. And it might be a little difficult to visualize all of that. So here's kind of how they went together. Let's go through those layers again. First, there's the color, and then there's the two tiled images, and then the page bottom and top gradients, and then there's that side-to-side gradient, and then that shading at the top for that last little bit, and that's it. But if you would prefer to see it sort of as a 3D model, then here's how they stack up. And yes, both this slide and the previous slide are HTML plus CSS animations that I captured out of the browser. But that's how those backgrounds were all stacked up. And here's the code. It looks a little bit complex, but honestly, most of that is the gradient syntax, right? Linear gradient syntax can be a little daunting, but when you think about it, it's a pretty compact format for a text description of images. And yes, gradients are images. They are every bit as much images as they are SVGs or PNGs or JPEGs or GIFs or whatever raster format or vector format you're used to. These are images. CSS treats them as images because that's what they are. They're just described with text, sort of like SVG is. And there are, if this seems like a little much, but you still want to play around with gradients, there are gradient generators online. You can find places where you can just basically drag color stops and set transparencies and all that sort of thing, and it will generate the syntax for you. I will admit I typed this by hand, but I'm weird that way. So anyway, now I mentioned briefly the footer in the last section, so I want to talk about that now. This is what the footer looks like. And here it is with the element box of that footer. Okay, so this is the whole footer that has an ID of global, it turns out. And here's the pseudo element, the before pseudo element that's attached to the footer, which is how I got those waves attached to the footer. Now I could have used padding on the footer element and then put these backgrounds in that padding area, but I decided I wanted to work with generated elements here, because if I had done this as padding, then the positioning of the waves that repeat along, I would have had to figure out how far to offset them from the top of the footer. And if I ever changed that, then I would have to like recompute in my head or on paper or whatever, how far down to push them, and then change the CSS. By doing it as a generated content element, a before element, I could actually put them along the bottom of that before. And then if I ever decided to make that before taller, then they would just stay along the bottom. Like, it was more convenient that way. So if we take away the before's background, this is what we're left with. Great. So the first thing to do here that I actually did in the footer itself is a subtle shading gradient that leads down towards the footer body. So this is actually, there's an extra shading gradient on top of the shading gradient that I did for the body. And then I repeated this image along the x-axis. This is just one image that's been repeated. And there's a strip you might notice where that image doesn't quite reach the bottom of the before element's background area, but that's okay, because I'm going to add this same image again, a little bit bigger, that covers up that gap. And using that same image at different sizes creates a pattern that looks kind of random and organic. It's not random. Like, if you look at it closely, you realize, okay, there are repetitions here. But it's good enough for like a quick glance. If somebody who's not like analyzing the design or the CSS closely probably won't catch that. It'll just feel like sort of this waves on the ocean that are, so far as we can see, random. And then there's a single large wave image on the left side because, I mean, why not? It seemed like it fit in and it made sense. I could always take that away later if I felt like it. And here's the code for that, right? Including the sizing and blending mode, which I used, among other things. The darken blending there, the mixed blend mode darken, lets things show through the footer's waves if they're placed there. It's not really necessary for the design as it is now. It's not doing anything visually in the current design, but I had considered things like putting a sort of a watermark on the body near the footer, and if it overlapped a little bit, I would want it maybe to show through. And then if I decided I didn't, I could always take away the mixed blend mode darken, and then it would be cut off and sort of sticking above the wave. So if I wanted to put a Godzilla back there or something, I could always do that. So some of those techniques got applied in different ways up in the header, where I actually split up the header. So here's the header with its element box highlighted, okay? I didn't actually use before or after on this element. I just styled the background of the element itself, but some of these same sorts of ideas come through, right? So if we take away the backgrounds for a moment, then add in the first of them, like this, I have this one image. And here it's pulled a little bit off screen to the left, and the vertical placement uses a calc expression that I arrived at, honestly, mostly by trial and error. There's probably, I could have drawn a grid and golden ratio and I don't know, whatever, and it would have found a place for it to go. But I decided, you know what, I want it pulled up 4.2% of the viewport width from the bottom. That it made sense. It worked. I don't know. So right, it first places the image at the bottom of the header and then pulls it up a little bit. This actually turns out to be about in terms of the width, it's about 29% as wide as the header. So that 29% auto makes it 29% as the width of the header element. And then the height is auto scaled to preserve the aspect ratio of that image. So next I added a different wave image on the right, pinned to the bottom right. and set to be 45% of the width of the header. And then here's literally another copy of that same left side wave, but it's bigger and it's pinned to the bottom, and it's also 45% the width of the header, which leaves 10% of the header clear of either wave right in the middle. Like right down the center, there's a 10% gap. And like I say, on the left, there's two copies of the same image. It's just one of them is a little bit smaller and pulled over, kind of like I did with the footer waves. And then I decided I wanted to give this a little more depth. So I put a translucent gradient in between those two, and that fades out the smaller wave in the background, right? So it makes it look further away because it's not as visually distinct. Maybe I made it a little too light. I don't know. Sometimes I think I should go in there and play around with it. Let me make that gradient but more opaque, right? And this is what it looks like when I just lower the lightness of that color. And this is that left wave element or image, excuse me, with a black background. So you can see which parts of the image are actually opaque and which aren't. So you can see I'm sort of in the PNG doing some masking by filling in a background color and then leaving some parts without that background color. I wish I had come up with a better way of doing this, and there probably are better ways of doing this, because I'd like to be able to change that color. But the closest I could get, at least that I could think of, was to have this as a layered Acorn file. I use Acorn, which is a sort of like Photoshop. It's a Mac OS application. So I have this in layers, and if I ever need to recolor that mask, I can go in and do it. Not ideal, but it was the best I could, like I say, it was the best I could come up with. And you put that in place, and then with that gradient, you get the illusion of depth, which I actually really like. The nice thing about this, though, the reason that I built it this way is that this is very responsive, right? This is actually what the background setup is set up like, because I styled mobile first. So on mobile, this is what this page looks like, right? This is what the header looks like. Just one image, just the one copy of header left. And then when you pull it apart, as the viewport gets bigger and you get up to tablet or desktop sizes, or I don't know, web TV sizes, you get the layered background that I showed how to construct. And I really like that because, you know, the waves resize based on the viewport, and I could have also set it up so that they were fixed widths and they sort of slid apart at wider sizes or some combination thereof. Not doing things that complicated right now, but the ability is there and all the pieces are in place. All I have to do is adjust like this CSS just a little bit at various media query points, and I can get all these different effects. I can drop images out, bring images in, that sort of stuff, which I found really handy. It was a degree of freedom, I felt like, as I was working on this design, because I design in the browser, right? I wasn't doing this first in Photoshop or as InDesign or Figma or Sketch or whatever, right? I was sort of thinking to myself, where do I want these things to be? What kind of effect am I going for? Then I could place pieces and then fiddle with them, right? Literally either by editing and saving and reloading or using the web inspector and altering values. I was able to really experiment really quickly, right? The header as it's shown now, do not think for an instant that this is how I had it envisioned to begin with. I actually went through 3 or 4 header designs that looked nothing like this. But again, because I was working with these pieces of images and being able to place them, I could fiddle with them and then say, this isn't coming together. I need to rethink what I'm doing here, right? And I can replace this image with a different image, and I can change the placement, and okay, that's not quite working, but it's closer, right? Really able to iterate very quickly, just in the browser, right? And so this didn't spring from my forehead fully formed. Nothing I do ever really does. But this was, like I say, it was just really easy to play with and to be able to like fiddle with the exact placement of the second wave that's supposed to be sort of further away. Like, how small do I want it to be? How exactly do I want it to be placed? You know, how much do I want to fade it? That kind of stuff. Really it's very freeing. It gave me so much freedom to experiment. And at the same time, see what the results were going to be in a browser, which is why I like designing that way. But I've been talking about these backgrounds and these techniques that have been all complicated and stuff, but backgrounds don't have to be this complicated. With just a line or two, you can create really nice separators. So as an example, see that line there between the text and the sort of metadata, the colophon, if you will, of this post. It looks like a horizontal rule maybe, but it's not. So this is the meta. I call it meta. It's a bit of metadata. Don't ask me why it's an unordered list. It's a long story, but that's the deal. And here's the element box with some margin and some padding. And then here's a 5 pixel tall background gradient. Okay. But if I take that 5, and you can see that it shades from black with 3/4 transparency to black with 7/8 transparency, and then back to black with 1/4 transparency. And it doesn't repeat. It's positioned in the center, 1em down, and then its width is 100% and its height is 5 pixels. And if I change that height from 5 pixels to 1 pixel, we get the 1 pixel tall separator. But instead of just being a straight line, right, it fades. And it fades towards the center. Why? Because I felt like it. I could have done it the other way around. It could have been a little bit darker in the center and lighter towards the edges. Or one of the things that I experimented with was going from dark on one side to lighter, darker on one side to lighter on the other. Then I flipped it the other way around. Eventually I came to this. It felt right to me. But yeah, I was just able to rearrange stuff and see what it looked like in these various permutations. I played with making it taller. I played with all that kind of stuff. But that's it. That's the whole thing, right? I don't have any more to show you about the separator. It is possible, however, to build on that sort of technique to make things a little fancier, like this separator that I use in some situations. So this is actually a horizontal rule, an HR tag. And here's the HR shown without any styles, right? I've just taken them all away. Okay, fine. HR, it's a line, kind of thick. That's what they tend to look like. But here's the HR with some margin and some height, because an HR is an element. It can be sized and margined and everything else, really. Because this, I've said this before, you've probably heard this before, but I'm going to reiterate, CSS doesn't actually care what you think elements should look like. You can think to yourself, a horizontal rule can never be 2.33em high or 10 pixels or whatever. CSS places no such restrictions, right? You can make your horizontal rule tall and discover that it's actually a 0 height box, right? That's what a horizontal rule basically is. It's a box with no content height. And so it has these borders around the outside. So I can make it taller, then I can turn off the the border, and the HR goes away. And then I put one of those 1 pixel gradients in. In this case, I decided to make it darker in the center and fade it out towards the sides, right? But it's basically the same thing that we saw in the previous section, the simple separator. But now I can put a thicker one on top of it, which fades out more quickly. So this actually, the effect should be visually that not only does this fade out towards the center, but it's thicker in the center and it gets thinner. So this is a visual illusion, right? It's a 3 pixel thick gradient on top of a 1 pixel thick gradient, but the 3 pixel thick gradient fades out here and the 1 pixel fades out here, right? That's how that's created. And I could have stopped there. In fact, at one point I did stop there and I wasn't going to do anything more with it. And then, as I got into it more and I was using more design elements from my source material, I decided, you know what? Let's make these even fancier. So I added a couple of images the same way that I did basically the left and right waves on the header. I just have 2 images, one for the left, one for the right. Sorry, one for the left, one for, I don't know. and then just position properly like that. And they're sized to make sure that they blend in with the rest of this, with the rest of these backgrounds. And then I thought, you know what? Let's put a thing in the middle. And now it's extra fancy. It has this little seal or whatever. Hey, why not? And there's a little bit more to this, or there was a little bit more to this at one point. So if you look really closely around the edges of that circle in the center, there's a little bit of visual separation from the line. And originally I was doing that as a radial gradient. Eventually I stopped. And here's the reason. This looks like a circle. It's not a perfect circle. It is not a Tool song, album, whatever. So when I was trying to line up this picture with a mathematically perfect computer calculated radial gradient, they didn't fit right. And I played around with it for a little bit, and I felt like, you know what, I could probably make this work, but I'm actually borrowing trouble here, right? I'm working too hard to make these things line up when I could just put a glow in the image around the visual parts of the image and call it a day, which is what I did, which is sort of similar to the way that I handled that one wave in the header, where parts of it are opaque and other parts are not. Similar kind of deal, which does mean, again, if I ever decided I wanted to change the background of the page, the overall page to be a little bit browner, a little bit more tan, or have a richer color to it, I'm going to have to go back and redo this probably. But again, that was a trade-off. At a certain point in my freedom of design, I realized you're taking the freedom into places that you're borrowing trouble, like I said, right? I'm fiddling with this so much in order to keep this one little piece of flexibility in a design that I fully control that I didn't need to. So I stopped. I made it easier on myself. So the code looks like this, right? There's the disk on top, the two trumpet images to the side, the couple of linear gradients to make the thing go from side to side. And I also added on a filter. I did some grayscaling because the source image was a little bit richer than I was looking for. And because I planned to use it in other places where I wanted that full color saturation, rather than create a separate version, I used a filter with some grayscale and some opacity variations. See, again, that's a place where the freedom made my life easy instead of the previous thing with the radial gradient where I was actually making my life hard, which I try not to do. It's a thing with me. So also there's a single line that covers all the repeats. So the background repeat, no repeat. Originally I had no repeat on every single one of these individual background statements. And then I realized, you know what? No, take all those out. None of these are repeating, just background repeat, no repeat at the bottom. Okay. Now, there are a lot of, I've already shown some things that can be done with backgrounds. And I talked a little bit about keeping things from seeming too mechanical by making things a little more organic. You can totally do that. This is an example from the Web Stories website. This shard that points down from all the other shards across the top of the page is not SVG. It's a CSS background. Now, the shards across the top, that is SVG that CSS is used to put in and whatever. But that shard that comes down towards February 5th, 2021, that's a CSS background. And I wanted to investigate that because there's some really interesting techniques in it. And there's also a little something that I'd like to fix. So this turns out to be a paragraph containing the text February 5th, 2021 online. That's what creates that whole thing. It's placed up in the corner and it's rotated a little bit. Let me make the CSS a little bigger so you can read it. Okay, there we go. Great. So, absolutely positioned. It's got a z-index of 1. It's rotated minus 15 degrees. So to see this part of the design better, I'm going to increase the z-index to put it on top of everything and zero out the rotation, which is what I did here. So like I said, this shard is an element, it's a background, but it's sticking out the edges of the element, right? The Firefox inspector is showing me these are the edges of the paragraph, but there's a background image outside of the element box. That's because it's actually not a background on the element. The background is set on an before pseudo element that's been positioned and made a little bit larger than the paragraph, which is, I mean, that's also a thing you could do. You know, it's been set up to do all this stuff. It's also been distorted with a transform. So to understand it a little better, let's undo those transforms. So I'm going to set the skew to 0 degrees. That shows it's actually a right triangle. And if I take the rotation and I set that to 0 degrees, we can see even more that it's a right triangle. It's just a right triangle that happens to be pointing downward. Okay, and now we can see there's the background image that's being used to create this effect. Background image, linear gradient, 64 degrees, transparent 50%, variable tertiary, I assume, color, 50%, which is what creates that hard stop, the fact that the transparent goes to 50% and the color goes from 50%. There's a transition, there's a smooth transition from transparency to whatever the tertiary color is that happens over 0 length. So it becomes effectively a hard stop. Okay, I'm actually going to move it down a little bit so we can see it more clearly, but I also want to point out and fix a hidden bit of fragility here, and it's in the 64 degrees. So what happens if, for whatever reason, this element becomes taller? See, when the size of the pseudo element changes, that 64-degree direction of the gradient stays constant. It doesn't change. So by making this taller, I've revealed more of that background by increasing the element size. We can see more of it before it gets clipped off by the edges of the before pseudo element. Conversely, if this were to be made smaller, then less of the background would be visible, and the shard would just be a shorter right triangle. But the original intent was, or the way it was originally designed, from what I can tell, was to have it become a right triangle. There's a way to fix this. Okay? By changing that 64 degrees, rather than having that specific degree value that's dependent on that very specific element size, or at least that element aspect ratio, I can just say to top right, rather than whatever. Because to top right does not point the gradient into the top right corner. You would think it does, but it doesn't. It actually points the gradient into the top right quadrant of the background of the image, such that the midpoint of the gradient is perpendicular to a line connecting the adjacent corners. And if that was difficult to follow, here's an illustration. That's how to top right is aligned. And if you wanted to envision what to top left means, just flip this in your mind, horizontally. So the start point and the end point of the gradient are aligned and positioned in exactly this way. And notice there's that line that goes across from the midpoint of the gradient that goes from the top left and bottom right corners. That is the adjacent corners to the top right corner. That's what to top right means. And to top left, to bottom right, to bottom left, that sort of thing. So if we take this and change this element size, it changes the shape. So that's why changing it to top right took this back to being a right triangle. Then if we restore the transforms to rotate and skew the pseudo element the way that it was originally, we get this, which, okay, I admit, the text is a little out of place in relation to the shard as compared to the original design, but that's something that could also be fixed. Whether changing it, how it's aligned to the element size or changing the element size, right? These are all things that could be figured out. I just literally changed like one thing to make a point and maybe slightly broke it. But the point being, you can use backgrounds to create surprisingly artistic effects. All of the shards across the top, rather than being an SVG, could be CSS gradients. I'm not saying they should be, right? For that sort of a pattern, using an SVG makes way more sense, but it could be done. It's really amazing what you can do with background images. You can get really, really artistic. Now, maybe you've seen this before, but if not, this is a piece of artwork constructed entirely of HTML and CSS. There isn't even any SVG in here, and it was all written by hand. It's just a stunning amount of artistry and effort that Diana went to here. A surprising amount of this particular effect is created with using border radius and 3D transforms, but some of it is done with backgrounds. For example, keep an eye on the lace in the rough as I remove just one background image. Okay, and keep your eye on the lace again as I remove a second background image. Okay, so these use both linear and conic gradients. I didn't get into conic gradients today because there's only so much time. But I strongly recommend going to the site, diving into the CSS via your browser's web inspector, just to see how these various bits are done. Let me back it up again. It's so cool. Like click, click, and then take out one of them, and then take out the other, right? Now, all the stuff that's done in here, it gets a little complicated. I'm not gonna lie. But inspecting one specific element, because this does use a lot of elements, figuring out how it was done can be a real learning experience. I mean, it was for me, diving in and figuring out how the eyes were done, how the blush on the cheeks, how were the hair strands created, the pearls, the lace, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? There were techniques used that I hadn't expected. When I looked at it, I thought, oh, this is how they're doing it. Oh, no, that wasn't how they were doing it. And when I thought about it, I realized my initial thought was way more complicated than what they came up with. If it had actually been done right. Just such great work here. Very few of us are ever going to create an oil painting out of HTML and CSS. But again, seeing how this was done strengthens our understanding of what we can do, right? The same way that apprentice painters would work with masters to watch how the master did their work, right? Electricians do this today, plumbers, painters, sculptors, all of which are their own forms of artistry, in my opinion, right? But by seeing how someone else does it, you get a better idea of how you can do it, and maybe sometimes it'll spark an idea in you as something related you can do. That was certainly the case for me. Now, if you'd like to see a set of less complicated but still very highly inventive artistic uses of backgrounds, I can't recommend highly enough Lynn Fisher's A Single Div. There's the URL. So pretty much anytime you see single element artwork, it's done with a lot of backgrounds because, as maybe hopefully I've illustrated, you can effectively have an infinite number of background images on an element, and it's before and after pseudo elements. So every single one of these art pieces is one div. As an example, the Mutant Ninja Turtles up there in the upper right-hand corner, that's not 4 divs, it's one div with backgrounds that create 4 turtles. The spark there, the arc between the two terminals, again, the whole thing, it's just one div. And because CSS allows you to create pseudo elements, it's a div with its before and after pseudo elements. Nearly every single one of these has at least one pseudo element, if not both. And that's where you get things like the text, at least in the don't move vote, that's generated content. Not all of the text on this page is generated content, but some of it is. And this page goes on for a really long time, which actually addresses a question I sometimes hear, which is, how is the performance for these backgrounds? It's pretty good. This whole page, this entire thing didn't really slam my laptop CPU too hard. And my laptop dates to 2013. You do want to be careful in mobile contexts. The nice thing is that, as I was talking about earlier, you can use media queries to easily simplify or remove entirely backgrounds. These become a layered experience, right? At mobile sizes, you might have 1 or 2 simple backgrounds. And then as you go up further, maybe you add more visual details in order to avoid those kinds of performance hits that can happen on mobile. Most of the performance issues have been resolved in my experience, but if you have a really complicated radial gradient, for example, that might be a bit of a drain on some mobile browsers. So, be careful. Okay, so this scroll stopped because this is where Firefox's full page screenshot command gave out at 10,000 pixels high. That's as far as the screenshot function will go. And that was about a quarter of the total page length. That thing that I just scrolled past, if you think of that 3 more times, that's about how tall the page is. But it is a good place to stop because I really like this licorice example right there in the center, which is a clever pattern and an optical illusion all in one. So here's the CSS for that div. And don't worry, I'm not going to walk through it step by step, nor do I expect you to understand it instantly. But here's what happens if I disable the background sizing. That's it. It's a single instance of that licorice pattern blown up to full size. And then when just that single thing is set to be 50 pixels by 35 pixels, it repeats in the way that CSS backgrounds do. And it gives us this. And part of the reason I really like this is it looks like the licorice strands curve slightly. They don't. Each strand is perfectly vertical. Check the left and rightmost strands against the edges of the element to verify that. Or, go in with a web inspector and drag out rules. I look at it now and I think, oh yeah, they're curving. That's really cool. How did she do that? Actually, she didn't. It's just an optical illusion. My brain is playing tricks on me. CSS is hacking my brain. But I also like this example from the bottom of Lynn's page. Captain America shield. If you're not familiar with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it's kind of a plot point, but regardless, that star there, that's generated content in a before pseudo element. And the shadow below it, that drop shadow, is an after pseudo element. I'm going to take those away. So we get just the shield, which is still nicely textured and only uses 5 background images. Right. So first there are the 2 highlights, the 2 they're highlights, right? There and there. And then there are the 2 lowlights, which are here and here. Okay. That's where where the lighting effects come from. It's just these 4 linear gradients that are set to go in various directions. But then there's the radial gradient, which creates all of the rings of the shield, right? It's this one. So going outwards, you get those hard stops by taking blue to 20%, starting red at 20%, taking that to 35%, then gray at 35% to 55%, and then red at 55% out the rest of the way, right? That's it. Well, and creating, using border radius to round out the div so that it creates a circle. But I mean, that's all it took. It's simple, but it's really effective. Even without the star and without the drop shadow, it's still, it's clip arty, but there's nothing wrong with that. And it's better than a lot of clip art I've seen. And it was created using pretty much this, just a couple of other rules, but pretty much this with backgrounds. I love that. And there are so many more examples on Lynn's page, literally hundreds. I think Firefox counted 305 child nodes of the body, which would correspond probably to 305 experiments, roughly. I mean, around there. These are a few of my very favorites, right? Or perhaps I should say a very few of my favorites. There were so many more I could have put on this page. I thought about it, but I just wanted to do this. And some of them are even animated because I didn't show this, but background images can in fact be animated in terms of their size, their position, and more, right? So the bookshelf one, where looks like it's sort of in the bottom there where it looks like a bookshelf in the dark that has a flashlight shining on it and some eyes. The flashlight moves around and the eyes then appear and blink. And I think some of these others also animate. Oh, the pen. If you hover over the pen, it changes. I won't tell you how. You can go find out. Yeah, I mean, just so many examples of that Lynn has done, and I mean, she could add more at any time. So yeah, some of them I just took screenshots. I didn't even dissect them, particularly the space shuttle launch and the cabinet next to it. I'm still not sure how she did those. I haven't looked, and I'm sure I will be incredibly impressed when I actually go look, because I look at them and I think, oh, okay, I see how the clouds were done at the bottom of the space shuttle along the bottom. Those are radial gradients, but the swoops, are those radial gradient? But it's a single element, and I don't know, and I kind of like that. I love not knowing. Only second to how much I love figuring it out and seeing what a master has done. Similarly, the perspective on that shelving unit. There's 3D perspective in there. Did she do it with 3D transforms? I don't think so, but I don't know. I'm looking forward to finding out. I kept a little mystery for myself before giving this talk, because yeah, I do want to know. And what can that, not only do I want to know what that'll teach me. I want to know what these examples and others that I didn't show because I didn't have room or didn't feel like I had room, what will they show me? What will they teach me? And that, to me, gets to the heart of what CSS is to me, and HTML and the web in general, right? There's so many things to learn. There's so many things to find out, so many perspectives to understand, and so much going on in the background, right, that we don't necessarily notice, or we glance past because we assume we know how it's done. And then if we dig a little deeper, we find out that it was done some other infinitely more clever way, right? And maybe a heart like this, which is an SVG, and that makes sense, but maybe there's a way to recreate it using nothing but a few elements and some CSS, using backgrounds, using generated elements to try to see, well, how would that be done? And what are the limitations there? What are the benefits? What are the drawbacks? To really dig in and figure out really how this medium works, and to challenge the preconceptions of how it works, right? To challenge our assumptions of what's possible and what isn't. That's what these kinds of experiments, particularly like Diana and Lynn did, and other people as well, that's what those experiments really excited me, is that knowledge that there is so much more to learn, and there are so many assumptions to be challenged, to be overturned, and more growth to be done. And I hope that by showing you some of these techniques, just a few, there are so many, that I will have stirred a little bit of that thought, that feeling in you. So thank you very much for having me join you. It's been an honor and a pleasure.